When the courtroom doors close, most people believe justice has been served. The judge has spoken. The sentence has been delivered. The case is over. But for the person standing in shackles, that moment is not the end of anything. It is the beginning of a system few people ever see, fewer understand, and almost no one escapes unchanged. There are no cameras waiting in the hallway. No journalists documenting what happens next. No explanation offered to the person whose life has just been handed over. The public leaves the courtroom believing the story is finished, unaware that an entirely different process has already begun behind closed doors. This is the moment when control quietly transfers, not to the prison, not to the guards, but to a system built on classification, risk scoring, internal labels, and silent decisions that will shape every hour, every movement, and every human interaction that follows. Within minutes of sentencing, paperwork begins to move. Files are created, codes are assigned, and internal assessments start stacking up, many of them based not only on what happened in court, but on information the inmate may never see. Prior charges, associations, psychological markers, institutional risk factors, sometimes even rumors. None of it is debated, none of it is explained, and none of it requires the inmate's consent. This process happens fast, often within the same building where the sentence was delivered. While families sit outside, stunned and confused, decisions are being made that will determine where their loved one will go, what kind of prison they will enter, and whether they will ever experience anything resembling normal incarceration. Because not all prison time is the same. Some inmates will be sent to facilities where movement is limited but social contact exists. Others will be placed into environments designed to restrict, isolate, and control behavior long before any violence ever occurs. These placements are not always based on actions, but on perceived risk. And once those decisions are made, reversing them becomes nearly impossible. This is the part of the justice system rarely discussed in public. It does not appear in sentencing guidelines. It is not explained during trial, yet it holds enormous power, sometimes more than the sentence itself. Two people can receive the same sentence for the same crime and live entirely different prison lives. One may spend years in general population, working jobs, earning small privileges, and maintaining contact with family. The other may be transferred through a series of controlled environments, placed under restrictions that follow them indefinitely, regardless of behavior. The difference is not always the crime. The difference is what happens after the courtroom closes. From this moment forward, the inmate no longer moves by choice. Transfers happen without warning. Facilities change overnight. Families receive no notice. Lawyers often learn about relocations after the fact. Midnight transports, chain buses, intake centers that operate more like processing plants than correctional facilities. Each stop strips away another layer of autonomy, replacing it with procedures designed for efficiency, not humanity. And the inmate learns quickly that asking questions does not produce answers. Why am I here? How long will I stay? What do I need to do to leave? In many cases, no one is required to tell them. This is not a failure of the system. This is how the system is designed to work. Control does not come through force alone. It comes through uncertainty, through rules that change depending on where you are, through decisions that are never fully explained, through a structure where compliance is expected, but clarity is optional. For many inmates, the most difficult part of incarceration is not the sentence length. It is the loss of understanding. Not knowing where you will be next week. Not knowing why restrictions apply to you, but not to others. Not knowing what criteria must be met to move forward. And the longer someone remains inside this system, the more permanent these conditions become. Files grow thicker. Labels follow transfers. Internal notes carry forward, often without context or review. An early classification decision can shadow an inmate for years, affecting housing, movement, work opportunities, and even parole considerations. All of this happens outside public view. There is no courtroom transcript for classification decisions. No appeals process that functions the way people imagine. No jury weighing evidence. Just internal systems operating continuously, quietly, and with extraordinary reach. This documentary is not about guilt or innocence. It is about what happens after that question is no longer asked. It is about the system that takes over once the verdict is final, the one that determines how prison time is actually lived, not how it is described in court. Because the truth is simple, and rarely spoken aloud. The sentence is only the doorway. What comes after decides everything. Tonight, we take you inside the hidden process that begins when the courtroom closes, and how it shapes lives long after the judge's voice fades. Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now let's step inside. The moment the courtroom empties is the moment control truly begins. When the judge steps down and the bailiff opens the side door, the public believes the process is complete. Family members leave in silence. Attorneys move on to their next case. The courtroom resets, ready for another trial. But for the person being escorted away, the justice system has only just shifted gears. This transition happens quietly. There is no announcement, no formal explanation, no clear indication that life has just entered an entirely new phase. What looks like a simple walk down a hallway is, in reality, the first step into a closed system that operates almost entirely out of public view. In most cases, inmates are not taken directly to a permanent prison facility. Instead, they enter a holding phase that functions like a sorting mechanism. County jails, intake centers, and temporary transfer units become the first stop, places designed not for long-term confinement, but for evaluation. This is where the real decisions begin. Within hours, sometimes minutes, correctional intake procedures activate. Identity confirmation, fingerprints, photographs, medical screenings, and background verification occur rapidly. To the inmate, it feels like paperwork and routine processing. But behind the scenes, something far more consequential is happening. This is where the system starts building a profile. Every inmate is reduced to a collection of data points: criminal history, prior incarcerations, alleged affiliations, behavioral notes, mental health indicators, even observations made during intake, posture, speech, emotional response, can be recorded. These details are not gathered to tell a story. They are gathered to predict risk. The system is not asking who you are. It is asking what you might become. This distinction matters, because once risk becomes the central question, fairness fades into the background. An inmate may have behaved calmly throughout trial. They may have no history of violence. They may even be a first-time offender. Yet if certain markers appear in their file, age, sentence length, alleged associations, or prior charges that never resulted in conviction, the system may begin treating them as a long-term control problem rather than a temporary inmate. And these early judgments carry weight. Classification at this stage is not final, but it is foundational. The labels applied here often follow inmates through multiple facilities, shaping how they are viewed by staff who have never met them. To the inmate, this phase feels disorienting. They are told little. They are moved frequently, and they are expected to comply without understanding. Questions rarely produce answers. How long will I be here? Where am I going next? What does my classification mean? In most cases, no one is obligated to explain. Families experience this confusion from the outside. Calls become brief or stop entirely. Locations change without notice. Online inmate locators update slowly or inaccurately. Loved ones are left guessing whether the silence means transfer, restriction, or punishment. But none of this is accidental. Uncertainty is a feature of the system, not a flaw. By limiting information, the system maintains control. Inmates learn quickly that resistance brings consequences, while compliance may, or may not, bring relief. This imbalance reshapes behavior faster than force ever could. During this period, inmates are often housed in environments that resemble punishment but are officially classified as temporary. Movement is restricted. Personal property is limited. Communication is controlled. These conditions are justified as necessary for processing, yet they introduce inmates to a reality they were never warned about in court. This is where many realize that their sentence length tells only part of the story. Two inmates may receive the same number of years, but their experience of incarceration may be radically different. One may pass through intake smoothly, receive a lower classification, and move on quickly. The other may encounter delays, restrictions, and additional scrutiny, sometimes triggered by nothing more than a note in their file. Once flagged, attention increases. Staff observe more closely. Reports accumulate. Opportunities narrow. And the inmate may never know exactly why. This early stage is also where the system begins preparing for transfer. Facility availability, security needs, and internal priorities all factor into where an inmate will be sent. These decisions are rarely based on geography or family proximity. Instead, they prioritize institutional convenience and perceived control. Midnight movements are common. Inmates are awakened, restrained, and transported with minimal notice. Sometimes they are told where they are going. Often they are not. Each transfer reinforces the same lesson. You do not decide where you go. You do not decide when you move. You do not decide how long you stay. By the time an inmate reaches their first long-term facility, much of their prison identity has already been defined, not by a judge, not by a jury, but by an internal process few outsiders ever see. This is the moment everyone stops watching. The trial is over. The headlines fade, and the system begins operating exactly as designed. What comes next will depend not only on behavior, but on classifications made during these first unseen hours, decisions that will shape daily life, movement, safety, and survival inside prison walls. And once those decisions solidify, changing them becomes one of the hardest challenges an inmate will ever face. Classification is where the prison system makes its most powerful decisions, quietly, internally, and without public oversight. To the outside world, classification sounds administrative, a technical step, a neutral process designed to organize inmates by risk and security needs. But inside the system, classification is far more than sorting. It is prediction. It is control. And once it is assigned, it becomes one of the hardest labels to escape. Most inmates never witness their own classification decision being made. There is no formal hearing, no argument presented on their behalf, no explanation of how the final outcome is reached. Instead, classification happens through internal assessments, scoring systems, and institutional judgment calls that rely heavily on past data, not future behavior. At its core, classification answers one question: how much control does the system believe this person requires? The answer determines nearly everything that follows: housing, movement, work eligibility, program access, contact with other inmates, even how staff interact with you. These decisions are not based solely on the crime that led to conviction. In many cases, the sentence itself matters less than the system's perception of risk. An inmate may have committed a nonviolent offense, yet still receive a high-security classification. Another may have a violent charge, but be assigned a lower level. The difference lies in a complex web of factors, some factual, others subjective. Classification files typically include criminal history, sentence length, age, prior incarcerations, disciplinary records, and alleged affiliations. But they may also include information that was never tested in court, intelligence reports, law enforcement notes, or institutional observations from intake. Once entered, these details gain a kind of permanence. Even when circumstances change, the file remains. This is where many inmates encounter a reality they were never prepared for. They realize that their prison life is not being shaped by what they do, but by what the system believes they might do. Risk-based thinking dominates classification. The system is designed to prevent future problems, not respond to past ones. As a result, caution always outweighs fairness. If there is uncertainty, the system chooses restriction. And uncertainty is everywhere. If an inmate has a long sentence, the system may view them as a long-term management challenge. If they are young, they may be labeled impulsive. If they are older, they may be flagged as resistant to authority. If they have prior arrests, even without convictions, those records can influence risk perception. The inmate rarely sees how these judgments are made. They may receive a classification code, a housing assignment, or a transfer order, but not the reasoning behind it. Requests for clarification are often met with vague explanations or none at all. This lack of transparency is intentional. By keeping classification opaque, the system avoids challenges. It also reinforces compliance. Inmates are expected to follow rules without knowing how success will be measured. Many assume that good behavior will lead to reclassification. Sometimes it does. Often it doesn't. Because classification is not purely behavioral. It is cumulative. An early label can outweigh years of compliance. Notes written during intake can follow an inmate indefinitely. A single incident, even one that did not result in formal discipline, may appear in internal records and influence future decisions. And the inmate may never know it exists. Classification also determines exposure. Lower-level inmates may have access to programs, jobs, education, and social interaction. Higher-level classifications often mean restricted movement, limited contact, and increased surveillance. These conditions affect mental health, stress levels, and long-term adjustment. Yet they are justified as preventative, not punitive. This distinction matters legally, but not experientially. To the inmate, restriction feels the same regardless of how it is labeled. As classification solidifies, the system begins aligning resources around it. Staff receive information that shapes expectations. Facilities prepare housing based on security needs. Movement schedules are adjusted. Even medical and mental health interactions may be influenced by classification level. The inmate becomes known not by name, but by code. And once that happens, individuality fades. This process also explains why two inmates with identical sentences can experience incarceration in radically different ways. Their classifications place them on entirely separate paths. One may be assigned to a facility that encourages gradual reintegration. The other may cycle through restrictive environments designed to contain rather than rehabilitate. From the system's perspective, both outcomes are justified. From the inmate's perspective, the difference can feel arbitrary and permanent. Reclassification reviews do exist, but they are slow, infrequent, and heavily dependent on institutional recommendation. In many cases, the same system that assigned the original label is responsible for deciding whether it should be changed. This creates a closed loop. The burden is placed on the inmate to prove they no longer pose a risk, often without knowing what criteria must be met. Time passes. Files grow. Labels harden. And as months turn into years, classification becomes less about assessment and more about maintenance. By the time an inmate understands the importance of classification, it is usually already working against them. This is the decision no one sees. Made quietly, recorded permanently, and capable of shaping an entire prison life. In the next chapter, we follow what happens once classification is set, when inmates are moved through the system in ways that feel sudden, unexplained, and impossible to predict. Once classification is set, movement becomes inevitable. For the inmate, transfer rarely arrives with explanation or preparation. There is no countdown, no schedule posted on a wall, no chance to notify family in advance. Instead, movement happens suddenly, often at night, and without negotiation. This is not a mistake. Transfers are designed to be efficient, unpredictable, and one-directional. The less an inmate knows, the easier it is to move them. In many facilities, transfers begin after lights out. Inmates are awakened, ordered to pack limited belongings, and restrained within minutes. Some are told where they are going. Many are not. Questions are discouraged. Compliance is expected. What follows is a process that feels less like relocation and more like erasure. Chain buses, transport vans, and temporary holding units move inmates through a network of facilities that operate largely outside public awareness. These are not destinations, they are corridors, places meant to hold people briefly while the system decides what comes next. During these transfers, identity blurs. Names are replaced by numbers. Time dissolves into waiting. Orientation disappears. Inmates may spend days or weeks moving between facilities, sleeping in unfamiliar environments, following rules that change with each stop. Meals are irregular. Communication is limited. Contact with the outside world becomes nearly impossible. Families often experience this phase as silence. Phone calls stop without explanation. Mail is returned or delayed. Online inmate locators show outdated information or no information at all. Loved ones call facilities only to be told the inmate is no longer there, or that staff cannot confirm their location. This confusion is not accidental. By limiting information flow, the system reduces interference. Transfers occur faster when there are no questions, no appeals, and no external pressure. Lawyers may learn of a transfer after it has already happened. Families may find out weeks later. For the inmate, this period is deeply destabilizing. There is no sense of continuity, no opportunity to adjust. Each new environment brings new expectations, new routines, and new risks. Rules that applied yesterday may not apply today. What was acceptable behavior in one facility may be punished in another. And yet, the inmate is expected to adapt instantly. This constant movement serves a purpose. It prevents attachment. It discourages resistance. And it reinforces the message that control rests entirely with the system. Transfers also serve as a sorting mechanism. As inmates move, staff observe behavior under stress. Compliance is noted. Reactions are recorded. These observations may quietly influence future placement decisions. In this way, transfer is not just logistical, it is evaluative. Some inmates pass through quickly, others linger. Those flagged for higher control may experience longer transit periods, more restrictive holding environments, or additional stops along the way. The inmate may never know why. At each stage, property is searched, limited, or confiscated. Personal items disappear. Paperwork is lost or delayed. Medical records may not arrive on time. Prescriptions change. Continuity of care breaks down. These disruptions are not always intentional, but they are accepted as collateral. Efficiency outweighs comfort. Control outweighs clarity. Eventually, most inmates arrive at a facility intended for longer-term housing. But even then, the transfer process may not be over. Reassignments occur. Beds fill. Security needs shift. Inmates are moved again, sometimes multiple times in a single year. Each move reinforces instability. Relationships are impossible to maintain. Programs are interrupted. Work assignments disappear. Any sense of progress resets. And the inmate learns an important lesson. Nothing here is permanent. This instability affects behavior in subtle ways. Some inmates withdraw, conserving energy and emotion. Others become hypervigilant, constantly scanning for changes. A few resist, which often leads to further restriction. The system responds accordingly. Transfers are justified internally as necessary for safety, capacity management, and operational efficiency. And in many cases, those reasons are legitimate. But the impact on inmates is rarely addressed. There is no orientation for repeated displacement, no acknowledgement of stress, no mechanism to restore continuity. Instead, movement becomes normalized. By the time an inmate settles into a facility, they may already carry the psychological weight of multiple transfers. Trust erodes. Expectations lower. Survival becomes the primary goal. And for some, the movement never truly stops. Certain classifications trigger repeated transfers, often under the justification of security or separation. These inmates become permanent movers within the system, never stable, never settled, always subject to sudden relocation. This constant motion serves one final purpose. It keeps inmates off balance. An off-balance population is easier to manage, less likely to organize, less likely to challenge decisions. From the system's perspective, unpredictability is control. From the inmate's perspective, it is exhaustion. By the time transfers slow or stop, much of the damage has already been done. Social ties are weakened. Motivation declines. And the inmate's identity within the system is firmly established. In the next chapter, we examine what happens when movement ends, when inmates are placed into environments designed not for transition, but for long-term control and separation. When the transfers finally slow, many inmates believe the worst is over. They have arrived at a facility. They have a bed. They have a routine. But for a significant number of inmates, this is where the system tightens its grip. Because not all housing is meant for living. Some units are designed for control. These environments go by many names: restricted housing, special management, administrative separation, but they share the same underlying purpose: to limit interaction, movement, and influence before problems can occur. Unlike disciplinary confinement, placement in these units does not always follow a rule violation. There may be no incident, no fight, no disobedience. In many cases, inmates are placed here based on classification alone. Perceived risk is enough. Once inside, daily life changes immediately. Movement becomes rare and scheduled. Doors open briefly, then close again. Human contact is reduced to the minimum required for operation. Inmates may spend most of their day inside a single space, eating there, thinking there, waiting there. Recreation, when permitted, often occurs alone. Communication with other inmates is limited or prohibited. This is not described as punishment. It is described as management. The distinction matters to the system because management does not require the same procedural protections. There is often no set-in date. Reviews may exist on paper, but outcomes change slowly, if at all. For the inmate, The experience is defined by absence. Absence of conversation. Absence of normal sound. Absence of meaningful time markers. Days blur together. Without social interaction, the mind turns inward. Thoughts loop. Stress accumulates. Sleep patterns shift. Small frustrations grow larger. The system is aware of these effects. But from its perspective, control outweighs comfort. These units are justified as necessary for safety, to separate individuals who may disrupt the broader population, influence others, or require closer monitoring. In some cases, this rationale is valid. Separation can prevent violence. It can stabilize volatile situations. But the criteria for placement are often broader than most people realize. An inmate may be separated due to alleged affiliations, intelligence reports, or prior conflicts, even if none have occurred at the current facility. Sometimes separation is used to preempt problems that have not yet happened. And once an inmate enters this environment, exiting it becomes difficult. Behavior alone may not be enough. Compliance is expected as a baseline, not rewarded as progress. Reviews may reference the same risk factors that justified placement in the first place, creating a cycle where the reason for confinement also prevents release from it. Time becomes the only measurable change. Weeks turn into months, months into years, and the inmate adapts. Some withdraw completely, minimizing interaction and emotion. Others attempt to maintain structure through routines, exercise, reading, writing. A few struggle openly, expressing frustration that is often recorded as instability rather than distress. Each response is documented. Each note becomes part of the file. These records rarely capture context. They capture behavior as it appears, not as it is experienced. And those records influence future decisions. The longer someone remains in separation, the more normalized it becomes. Staff rotate, policies shift, but the inmate remains. This environment also reshapes how authority is perceived. When interaction is limited, each encounter carries more weight. A single decision can affect access to basic privileges. Power imbalances become sharper. The inmate learns quickly which actions are safe and which are not. Expression narrows. Compliance becomes survival. For some, separation leads to long-term psychological consequences. Difficulty concentrating, heightened anxiety, emotional flattening. These effects may persist even after release into less restrictive settings. Yet the system rarely accounts for this transition. Moving from isolation back into population can be overwhelming. Noise feels amplified. Social interaction becomes exhausting. Trust erodes. Some inmates request to remain separated because reintegration feels harder than confinement. From the system's perspective, this reinforces justification. The environment worked. Control was maintained. Problems were avoided. But the cost is carried quietly by the individual. And once an inmate has been identified as someone who requires separation, that label can follow them indefinitely. Future facilities may replicate the same conditions based on past placement, regardless of current behavior. This creates a layered system of control. Classification determines placement. Placement determines environment. Environment shapes behavior. Behavior reinforces classification. Breaking this cycle is rare. And for many inmates, this chapter of incarceration becomes the defining one, the period that reshapes how they think, respond, and survive within the system. In the next chapter, we examine why leaving this system, even after years of compliance, is so difficult, and how institutional momentum keeps people locked into roles they did not choose. By the time inmates reach this stage of incarceration, many believe they have learned the rules. They comply. They avoid trouble. They follow procedures exactly as instructed. From the outside, this behavior looks like progress. From the inside, it often changes nothing. Because the prison system is not designed to reward improvement quickly. It is designed to maintain stability. And stability favors caution over change. For inmates who have been classified as high risk, repeatedly transferred, or placed in restrictive environments, the path forward narrows dramatically. The system begins to treat them not as individuals capable of change, but as long-term management concerns. This is where many inmates become stuck. Reviews still occur. Files are still updated. But momentum now works against them. The longer someone remains under control measures, the more those measures appear justified. Time itself becomes evidence. If they've been here this long, there must be a reason. This logic is rarely questioned. Reclassification reviews often rely on the same records that justified restriction in the first place. Early assessments, intelligence notes, and historical labels carry forward, sometimes outweighing years of compliant behavior. An inmate may have avoided disciplinary reports for years. They may have followed every rule. Yet when review time arrives, the conclusion remains unchanged. Risk is still perceived. Control is still preferred. The inmate is told to keep doing what they're doing, but no clear benchmark is provided. This ambiguity erodes motivation. When progress is undefined, effort feels meaningless. Some inmates continue complying out of habit. Others disengage emotionally, conserving energy rather than hoping for change. The system interprets both responses differently, but neither guarantees relief. Institutional processes also move slowly by design. Decisions are reviewed by committees. Recommendations pass through layers of approval. Each layer introduces delay, caution, and the possibility of denial. No one wants to be responsible for a decision that later appears risky, so the safest option is often to do nothing. This creates a culture where maintaining the status quo is rewarded, while change requires justification. For an inmate, this means that improvement must be exceptional, prolonged, and clearly documented. Yet even then, outcomes are uncertain. Transfers complicate this further. Each time an inmate moves, continuity breaks. New staff inherit old files without context. Progress made at one facility may not be recognized at the next. Programs started are interrupted. Recommendations disappear into administrative gaps. The inmate starts over again. This repeated reset reinforces the feeling that the system has no exit ramp. Even when inmates qualify for lower security placement, logistical barriers arise. Bed space may be unavailable. Institutional priorities shift. Security concerns elsewhere take precedence. The inmate waits, and waiting becomes the defining experience. Some inmates attempt to advocate for themselves through formal requests and appeals. These processes exist, but they are limited. Responses are slow. Outcomes are often vague. Persistence may be recorded as agitation rather than initiative. Others rely on legal counsel, only to discover that many internal decisions fall outside judicial oversight. Courts defer to correctional discretion. The system regulates itself. This autonomy gives correctional institutions extraordinary power over daily life, power that extends beyond the sentence itself. For inmates nearing parole eligibility, classification and placement history can influence outcomes indirectly. Records of separation, restriction, or perceived risk may shape how readiness is evaluated. Again, behavior alone is not enough. The system remembers everything. This accumulation of institutional memory creates a form of inertia. Once an inmate is categorized in a certain way, changing that narrative requires sustained effort and cooperation from the same system that benefits from stability. As a result, many inmates adjust their expectations. They stop planning for progression. They stop anticipating change. They focus instead on surviving where they are. From the outside, this may look like acceptance. Inside, it is often resignation. The system does not announce this transition. There is no moment where hope officially ends. It fades gradually, replaced by routine. Yet even within this rigidity, the system maintains its justification. Order is preserved. Violence is reduced. Operations continue. The cost is measured quietly. Years pass under conditions that were never part of the sentence delivered in court. Restrictions extend beyond what the judge described. Control becomes the defining feature of incarceration. And when inmates eventually leave these environments, whether through reclassification, transfer, or release, they carry the imprint with them. The system's influence does not end at the gate. This is why leaving the system is so hard. Not because inmates refuse to change, but because the system is designed to remember who it once believed they were. In the final segment, we step back and examine what all of this means, not just for inmates, but for a justice system that operates largely unseen once the courtroom closes. When people talk about justice, they usually talk about the courtroom. They talk about trials. They talk about verdicts. They talk about sentences measured in years. But what happens after the courtroom closes rarely enters the conversation. Once the judge leaves the bench and the public exits the room, a different system takes over. One that does not operate in public, does not explain itself clearly, and does not measure time the way the outside world does. This documentary was not about guilt or innocence. It was about what happens after that question is no longer asked. We followed the path that begins the moment sentencing ends, through intake, classification, transfers, restriction, and the slow accumulation of institutional control. We saw how decisions made quietly, often early, can shape an entire prison life. Not because of behavior alone, not because of a single incident, but because of how the system predicts risk and prioritizes stability. This is a system designed to prevent problems before they happen. In many ways, it succeeds. Violence is reduced. Order is maintained. Operations continue. But that success comes at a cost that is rarely acknowledged. The cost is uncertainty. Inmates are expected to comply without clarity, to improve without knowing how progress is measured, to wait without knowing how long waiting will last. They move through environments that change suddenly, guided by decisions they never witness and may never fully understand. For the families on the outside, the experience is equally disorienting. Loved ones disappear into a system that offers few explanations. Transfers occur without notice. Restrictions appear without warning. Information is fragmented, delayed, or unavailable. And over time, silence replaces expectation. This is not the justice system most people imagine. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. It is administrative, procedural, and continuous. Its power comes not from force alone, but from structure, from files that grow thicker, labels that harden, and processes that favor caution over change. Once someone enters this system, leaving it becomes difficult not because they refuse to adapt, but because adaptation does not always alter perception. The system remembers what it once believed, and that memory shapes future decisions. This raises difficult questions. How much of a sentence is determined in court, and how much is decided later, behind closed doors? How much control should institutions have over daily life beyond what a judge described? And how visible should these processes be to the public that authorizes them? These are not simple questions, and this documentary does not pretend to offer simple answers. But understanding the system matters. Because the moment society stops watching is the moment power becomes absolute. Transparency fades, oversight weakens, and control becomes routine. For those inside, this reality shapes every day. For those outside, it remains largely unseen until someone they know enters the system and begins to disappear into it. The courtroom may be where justice is announced, but the prison system is where justice is lived. And the gap between those two realities is wider than most people realize. If this documentary changed how you see the justice system, if it revealed processes you were never told about, then its purpose has been fulfilled. Because awareness is the first step toward accountability. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.